This morning, Texas is awash in cash. A record budget surplus next year, but what should all that money be spent on? We'll discuss what's likely from lawmakers. Beto O'Rourke starting a statewide tour Tuesday, but taking our questions this morning about the Texas electric grid struggling through another week and what his upcoming fundraising report will show. A Republican from Frisco with an idea that has everyone talking. He wants to ban minors from social media. Don't they have rights, though, and how would you enforce it? State Rep Jared Patterson lays out what he's thinking. And Texas Democrats spent the weekend in Dallas, the Vice Chair for Finance, Chris Hollins, on opportunities that Democrats see going into November.
Inside Texas Politics with Jason Whiteley starts now.
Good Sunday morning to our viewers on what will be another blazing hot week across our state. With that in mind, let's begin our program with the top political headlines here in Texas. State lawmakers will walk into the Capitol next year with an extra $26 billion to spend. This is a record surplus and is partly because of higher gas prices and all the taxes they generate in addition to sales taxes. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick says he wants to give a lot of this back to taxpayers in the form of property tax relief. A third poll now shows the governor's race has grown tighter in Texas. The University of Houston did this latest survey. It shows Greg Abbott leading Beto O'Rourke by 5 percentage points. O'Rourke has closed the gap since the Uvalde school shooting and the problems with the Texas electric grid. And in Houston, a mile-long convoy of 52 school buses outside Senator Ted Cruz's home and office. Each of these buses had personal memories of children killed in mass shootings. A group called Change the Ref is behind it. It wants Cruz to turn down future donations from the NRA and to support universal background checks, among other things. Candidates for Texas governor are not waiting on Labor Day as the traditional start of campaigning here in the state. On Tuesday, Beto O'Rourke is starting a 49-day tour across Texas. He is rising in the polls, and he just outraised Greg Abbott on Friday in the latest campaign finance reports. We invited both Abbott and O'Rourke on Inside Texas Politics this week, but only O'Rourke said he was available, so we start our program with him. Congressman, thanks for being here. You're starting the statewide tour on Tuesday, and many of these places are towns across the state and cities that you have visited before. But how is your message going to be different this time?
I've visited all of these places before, and not just in 2018, but many of these so far in this race for governor. But we keep coming back because we've got to listen to and learn from the people that we want to serve. And to your question, Jason, it is reflecting back what I'm hearing. We want to focus on public schools, having the backs of our public school educators, paying them enough so that they don't have to take a second or third job, listening to them when they say that the STAR test is not helping them right now. Let's replace that with something that's a true diagnostic in that classroom that really supports those educators and those students, and focus on funding public education. Let's make sure that we expand Medicaid so more people can see a doctor and create better, higher paying jobs in Texas while we work on reducing inflation and improving the cost of living in this state. These are the issues that matter most to most of us, Republicans, Democrats, independents alike, and that's the message of this campaign.
Congressman, you mentioned inflation there. I want to ask you about that specifically. The most recent numbers we saw come out the other day shows that inflation is up 9% from June of this year to June of last year. Are you concerned at all that that might really weigh down your campaign and hurt Democrats across the state come November?
The number one driver of inflation in the state of Texas is Greg Abbott. Our property taxes have gone up $20 billion in the 7 years that he's been governor. That's a 40% increase. On average, our utility bills are going up $45 a month after the power grid failed in the energy capital of the world. He still hasn't fixed the grid, but we're left holding the bag with higher utility bills. Cost of groceries have gone up when he shut down U.S.-Mexico trade. So I think that inflation is going to work against Greg Abbott. I think it's another reason why Democrats and increasingly Republicans are turning to us. We're going to reduce property taxes, reduce utility bills, make it more affordable to live and raise your family right here in the state of Texas.
You know, twice last week, the state got really tight on electric supplies. Doesn't Texas need to incentivize more natural gas-powered electric plants in the state?
that can turn on immediately when the sun isn't shining in West Texas or the wind isn't blowing?
Absolutely. I think it needs to be all of the above. And I'm so grateful for and proud of the fact that we're an energy leader in oil and gas. And as you said, gas is an important fuel source for the generation capacity that we need here in the state of Texas. When you supplement that with solar and wind and increasingly geothermal and in the future hydrogen, you have a mix in our portfolio that ensures sustainability, allows us to confront climate change, and guarantees that we can be the leader in the world on energy, not just today, but for the next century. That's what we have to be focused on now in Texas.
The last two polls for governor show that you're really narrowing the gap. It's down to 5 to 6 points behind Governor Abbott right now. You continue to close the gap, but how do you continue to sustain that momentum?
We do this by working with and listening to the people of Texas everywhere. I mean, certainly you're going to see us a lot in Dallas and Tarrant County, but Collin and Denton, Grayson and Fannin, we're going to the places that so often are written off or taken for granted and talking about the issues that matter most. World-class schools, great jobs for everyone in the state of Texas, and then expanding Medicaid so that we can see a doctor and drive down our property taxes. That's a winning message. And the contrast is with Greg Abbott, who's tried to outlaw abortion, tried to make sure that every Texan can carry a gun without a background check or any vetting or training whatsoever, and is on the fringe and the extreme spectrum of our politics right now, making it harder to create jobs, grow businesses, and make this the great state that we know it is. We need a governor that reflects the power and the genius of the people of Texas. That's why we're running. That's how we're going to close this gap. That's how we will win.
Congressman, we appreciate the time.
Okay, thank you so much, Jason. Grateful to you.
No matter who is elected governor this fall, when Texas lawmakers return to Austin in January, they will have an extra $26 billion to spend. It's far more than the state comptroller Glenn Hagar originally predicted. The extra cash is because people were still spending money with sales taxes and from oil and gas taxes as well. The big question, though, is what should lawmakers spend that money on? Ian Mitra is the senior managing editor of the Texas Tribune. Ian, good to see you again. The lieutenant governor released a list of things he wants to spend that money on. He's obviously very influential. What do you expect the money will go to?
Yeah, and also the comptroller had some potential things that could be considered. You know, the comptroller Hager kind of talked about infrastructure aspects, water, roads, things like that. And I think anytime you have a surplus, I think there's going to be talks about property taxes, and I think that's where the lieutenant governor really wants to, and probably some of his Republican colleagues are going to want to talk about too, is like, you know, is property tax cuts, potentially some vehicle gas tax cuts, which, you know, as we're kind of seeing these prices at the pump, which could be a potentially popular idea. Yeah. And in the meantime, we're also talking about, like, you know, education and things like that. And so there's going to be a big debate about, you know, kind of where to go. There's a lot of money potentially here to divvy up.
A lot indeed. Let's talk about ERCOT struggling to keep up last week with the state's power demand. But we also have, as the Tribune pointed out, the worst air quality in a decade. And at the same time, the state pushing back against the EPA standards.
Yeah, this is a challenge because, you know, obviously with the heat and, you know, combining the heat with emissions from industrial and vehicle sources, I think there's an increase in smog, and so in air quality. Yeah. And so the question is like what to do about it. And so, you know, obviously there have been, you know, EPA efforts to kind of, you know, address kind of ozone levels and stuff. But, you know, with Texas being in the situation it is with its own grid, right, they argue that, you know, that presents challenges to try to, like, you know, when we rely on our own grid, most of the state to try to go to these renewable sources. So that's just the challenge here as we continue to face this heat and, you know, smog.
Yeah, a lot to deal with indeed. I am back to you in just a moment. Thank you very much. Coming up next here, Texas Democrats heading home after their weekend convention in Dallas. We'll talk with one of the party's leaders about opportunities that he sees going into November. And a Republican from Frisco says he wants to ban minors from social media. State Rep Jared Patterson is with us on this idea that has everyone talking. And it is an interesting time to be an openly gay Republican in Texas. Our guest on Y'all-itics this week said that, and he explains why he still feels welcome in the Texas GOP despite his sexual identity. This episode is out now. Look for Y'all-itics wherever you get your podcasts. Texas Democrats are making their way home this morning after a weekend in Dallas. The state political party just wrapped up its convention here. This morning, though, what is the outlook for November from the inside of the Texas Democratic Party? We began there with Chris Hollins, the party's vice chair of finance.
Chris, good to see you again. Welcome back to the program here. Let me ask you about what people are talking about across the state and across the country, inflation and President Biden's approval numbers. Are you concerned at all that both of those or either of those might weigh down on Democrats come November?
Well, Jason, thanks for having me on. It's always great to see you and be here with you. Look, inflation is hurting all of our pocketbooks, and there are a lot of things going on, including the war in Ukraine, that are affecting this. The pandemic has also touched on this. But right here in Texas, we got to ask ourselves, what's happening with inflation here? And we know, and Republicans have even admitted, that Greg Abbott's antics down at the border are driving up prices, are wasting, food that should be feeding Texas families, and so many other things that are hurting our pocketbooks and ultimately hurting our ability to support our families. And so that's what Democrats are fighting for here in Texas.
Democrats have been in Dallas all weekend for the state convention, which just wrapped up last night there. What do you think the biggest takeaway is going to be from the convention?
Well, the short of it is that Democrats across Texas are fighting for you, they're fighting for your community, and they're fighting for your family. Republicans are going to war with Disney, they're going to war with Buzz Lightyear, they're going to war with women who want to make their own healthcare decisions. And Democrats are fighting for you. We want to keep you safe. We want to keep your schools and your grocery stores safe. We want to put more money in your pocketbooks. We want to make healthcare more affordable for you, for your kids, and for your family. And so that's the message.
Chris, let's talk about South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley for just a moment here too. Republican Congresswoman Myra Flores, she flipped a Democratic seat down in the Valley in a special election recently. We all know McAllen recently, not too long ago, elected a Republican mayor, even though it's a nonpartisan seat there. Donald Trump did better than anyone expected down in the Valley as well too. There are a record number of migrants coming across the southern border. Are Democrats and is the party taking this situation and this part of the state seriously enough?
Look, you can't take any votes for granted, regardless of, what someone's socioeconomic status is, what their ethnicity, their religion is. We have to go and fight for every single vote. And so, those elections should be, opening some eyes. And we know that we stand for the values of the folks in those communities. They care.
Should the party be doing more, do you think, to defend these areas?
We have to invest across this Texas, whether it's across this state, pardon me, whether we're talking about urban areas or rural areas, where we're talking about North Texas or South Texas. And so, again, this is an incredibly large state. It's incredibly expensive to campaign in the many media markets, as you know here. But yes, we should be doing more, and we shall be doing more. But again, we have to carry the message and make sure that voters understand why these elections are important, why it's important to turn out for every election, not only just the president in 20 and 24, but every single election, because these affect your community.
Chris, good to see you.
Always a pleasure, Jason. Have a good one.
This next conversation began with a tweet. A Republican from Frisco has proposed something no other state has done: banning minors from social media. The story took off around the world, but this morning we're talking about how all this might work. State Rep Jared Patterson from North Texas says he'll formally propose this when the legislature reconvenes in January.
Representative Patterson, let's start with a basic question here. In the days since you announced this idea, what kind of reaction have you had to it?
It's been a mixed bag. Twitter has been pretty negative, but Twitter's a pretty negative space anyways, at least in my experience. But what it's done, I think the most, is started a number of conversations with parents about the effects of social media on their children. And at the end of the day, I think that's the best thing that's come out of this so far.
And speaking of parents, doesn't this idea perhaps impede parental rights on what their children should be exposed to?
That's a really good question. I've been a leader on parental rights. Just this year, I've been working on more parental involvement on the selection of library books related to sexually explicit books and that sort of thing. But the problem is that parents don't stand a chance when you're talking about artificial intelligent machine learning algorithms on these social media platforms. You're talking about teams of engineers behind the scenes, even child psychologists that are hired to hook in these children to keep them on the social media platforms longer, and to put them down these rabbit holes and some things that are pretty disturbing.
Where did the idea come from? How did you develop this? Was it after what happened in Uvalde, or had this been percolating for a while?
It's been percolating for a while, just talking to other parents. I have 3 children myself. That's kind of where it started. But after the Uvalde shooting, I held a number of meetings with school board members, with law enforcement, with superintendents, and certainly not as a one-size-fits-all solution to gun violence. But it is something, a theme that kept coming up in these discussions about things that are harming our kids and things that aren't good for our kids, especially related to mental health. We already have laws in place about tobacco, alcohol. Children can't buy firearms. There's a lot of laws protecting the physical health of kids, but I think it's time that we have the conversation and time to put forward mental health as being as significant as physical health for our kids.
Well, let me ask you about that, because immediately when I saw this headline, I thought, well, doesn't this impede a child's First Amendment right?
That's a really good point. I think that as legislators, we've got to find that balance. Number one, our top priority is to protect the rights of those that we represent. But I think that we've also got to figure out where that line is. So have Second Amendment rights and Third Amendment rights and Fourth Amendment rights. But I think that as a society, we have gone through and passed laws to better protect people, based on protecting their rights, but also protecting their health and well-being.
Here's the last question I have. How in the world would you enforce something like this?
Even though we don't have words on paper yet, we don't have a bill that's ready to file yet. We're currently researching ways that we can do that. But I think we've got to hold the social media companies responsible and put the onus on them to make sure that they're not targeting our kids and that they're not putting our kids through something that damages their mental health. You look at suicide rates. Suicide rates from 10-year-olds to 14-year-olds declined from 2007, and then tripled from 2007 to 2017. We have a major problem in the state, and I believe that social media is a big piece of the pie.
This is a piece of legislation we'll definitely be watching. We appreciate the time.
Thank you, sir.
Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton is polling more popular than Dan Patrick and John Cornyn. So does this mean Paxton might be considering running for another office? One of the questions for the roundtable in just a moment. Time now for Reporters Roundtable to put the headlines in perspective. I am Mitra is back with us from the Texas Tribune in Austin. Bud Kennedy is here with us each week from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and Bernadine Steptoe is a political producer at WFAA in Dallas. And let's start with you and those significant numbers, staggering number from Beto O'Rourke, the fundraising amounts that both he and Greg Abbott announced on Friday. This is really going to shape up to be a competitive race with numbers like this.
These are pretty staggering numbers. Beto O'Rourke announced, that he's raised more than $27 million in this last reporting quarter, and which is, outpacing the governor, although Abbott overall has more cash on hand. These are big numbers for both candidates, but O'Rourke's number shows that he's not going anywhere. There's going to be a lot. This is going to be a very strong campaign in terms of a lot of, from both sides, just a lot of messaging and stuff. So this is going to be interesting. Ultimately, it comes down to what people are talking about ahead of the election. But Beto O'Rourke's fundraising numbers show he's not going anywhere.
But it looks like that O'Rourke has the momentum with the most recent polling and with these numbers as well too. Greg Abbott, though, on the other side, is really trying to tie O'Rourke to President Biden. Is that enough to win?
Abbott's new billboards combine Beto and Biden and try to portray him as a Beto or Beto, whatever you want to say. The thing is that Beto O'Rourke's the only Democrat who could have raised this much money. He's the only Democrat who could be running this close to Greg Abbott right now. This is the Beto party right now, and it's just a matter of how far Beto is able to go. Abbott is in great position as a Republican in the middle of a Democratic presidential term in the White House.
And Bernadine, Abbott is in great position. How far can Beto go?
Well, he's raising the money that he needs, and he sure is going to raise more. Because look at this, we're going out, they're campaigning a month before a traditional kickoff date, which is Labor Day. So, and Abbott is not going to take Beto for granted, and Beto knows not to take Abbott for granted. It's going to be a competitive race, and Beto is going to do well because he continuously narrows that gap.
And let's switch off, Bud, to talk about some recent polling. Ken Paxton doing pretty well when it comes to Republicans.
Well, Paxton doing well and popular among Republicans. But, you look at the other poll, the Texas Tribune poll, that shows that really only about 35% of the voters have made up their mind to support Paxton or Dan Patrick in the fall. There's a lot of undecideds out there. Those are the two weak links on the ticket when it comes to the general election.
Bernadine, as far as the polling goes, more than half of Texans polled recently say that Texas is headed in the wrong direction. How much is that going to impact Abbott come November?
Well, he knows it's going to impact him, and that's why he's out. He's in Dallas. He comes to North Texas, and he knows that he has a competitive race, and he's going to run a race as if it is competitive.
And then, Ian, last question for you. He's clearly, Abbott is running a competitive race here too. But the question is, can Beto sustain this momentum he has in polling and in fundraising?
It's a great question. And, as we've said, O'Rourke is a prolific fundraiser, but so is Abbott. It's going to be interesting because we have to see what people are talking about too.
Yeah.
Right now we're in the midst of a heat wave. There's a lot of frustration about how things are being handled, and but there's also like this frustration on the federal level too.
Right.
And so if this is a debate on the federal level, then I think Abbott's, is going to be in a much stronger position.
Yeah, we're still, 100-something days before the election. A lot of things could happen between now and then. Ian, Bud, Bernadine, thank you very much. We appreciate it. We'll see you again next Sunday. Thanks for watching this week. Take care.